So I am Esria Sharon, and I'm the chair and the co-founder of the Boulder Nablus Sister City Project. I returned just 3 days ago from 2 weeks in Nablus, and now I'll just take a moment to introduce the panelists. I will not repeat what you can find in the program. However, I will note that we have 2 guest speakers this morning, so their bios are not in your program. So I will give them a little bit more time so that you have a better sense of who is here with us today. So I'll start with Mr. Robert Kaufman. And in addition to what you have seen in his biography, he is probably the #1 Beach Boys fan, and he sees this issue through the prism of creating an environment where my buddies and me are getting real well known. The bad guys know to leave us alone. Sorry I didn't sing it.
I get around.
He gets it. And seated to his right is Mr. George Rishmawi. He's the executive director of the Masar Ibrahim Al-Khalil, the Palestinian portion of one of the most adventurous hiking trails in the world, the Abraham Path, spanning 700 miles through the Middle East. The Masar brings people from all faiths and no faith to retrace the steps of Abraham between Jenin and Hebron in Palestine. Visitors experience Abrahamic values, traditions, and most famously, hospitality. He's also the promotion coordinator for the Siraj Center in Beit Sahor. From Bethlehem, George has devoted his adult life to working for peace and is a community-based tourism and development expert who has developed and promoted community-based tourism in Palestine for many decades, providing a unique experience of the people, culture, and land. Seated to his right is Mr. Neil Diamant, and Neil grew up on a kibbutz in Israel, and he was a veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces from 1982 to 85, and he taught at Tel Aviv University for 3 years, and currently one of the courses that he teaches is on Zionism, on Zionist history. And lastly, Mr. Micha Kurz he was born and raised in Jerusalem. He was a combat soldier in the Israeli military and is now a supporter of a number of community-based human rights initiatives in his city. He's an early founder of Breaking the Silence and formerly on the board at the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's the founder of Grassroots Al-Quds, a Palestinian platform for community mobilization and advocacy to put Jerusalem back on the map as the Palestinian capital. Currently, Micha is leading Solidarity, Not Aid, an initiative to support community leaders overcoming the dominance of large international aid organizations over political movements and civil services in disempowered communities. He supports the work of Palestinian communities in Jerusalem, connecting international solidarity movements, politicians, and funders. He strategically networks and mobilizes activists and organizations around the world. So before we get started, I'll just mention that I'm going to give each of the panelists 5 minutes to make opening remarks, and then following those remarks, each will then have 2 additional minutes to respond to what others have said, and then we'll open the discussion up to your questions. And because our time is short, I have a couple of these note cards that I'm going to use to help keep us on track if needed. The yellow card is a signal that a panelist has 1 minute remaining, and the red is a request to kind of wind up your thought so that we can move to the next panelist. I'm aware, I think we're all aware, that this topic needs considerably more time than what is allotted. However, we do want to have a chance to hear our panelists' responses to your questions. So I appreciate all of our commitment and cooperation to kind of respect the time and the cards. So with that, we'll begin, and I'll ask Robert Kaufman to start with his opening statement.
The panel's name shouldn't be, does Israel have a green light? The panel's name should be, is it a new day or a return to the old days for the special relationship between the United States and a decent democratic Israel, where an administration has the strategic clarity to defend and support decent democratic friends while deterring illiberal foes seeking to undermine the United States and to eradicate a decent democratic Jewish state. It is a new day or a renewed old day and a good day thanks to the outcome of November of 2016. Although I'm not an unequivocal Trump supporter and wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal that got some wide airplay, what is a Reagan internationalist to do in this election, I have overall, with some qualifications and asterisks, been pleasantly surprised that after 8 years of an administration that took an adversarial position toward Israel, among other things concluding by ignominiously trying to put Israel on the path of delegitimization, not exercising the veto in November of 2016 to make the so-called occupied territories a violation of international law were Israel to build there. This is a new day. The Trump administration believes, so do I, Israel is a strategic asset. The Trump administration believes, so do I, that Iran is the primary danger in the Middle East, not a decent, democratic Netanyahu government. The Trump administration also believes, and so do I, that although ideally, or to put it in another language, the best practicable solution would be a two-state solution with Israel having defensible boundaries as a Jewish state with Jerusalem as its capital. The conditions for peace right now are not propitious. You have a raging sectarian war in the Middle East. You have an Iranian regime that has repeatedly called for Israel's ratification and is now being enabled to cross the nuclear threshold by an improvident deal that the Obama administration signed that you can't enforce and you can't verify, and even if you could, Iran will be on the cusp of crossing that nuclear threshold. That is, to quote the great Celtics announcer of their heyday, Johnny Most, all over. The Trump administration now has, among other things, a wonderfully intrepid ambassador at the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who has stood forthrightly against the vicious, systematic demonization and double standard of a decent democratic state that the Obama administration tolerated and encouraged. So it is a new day, it's a good day, and Israel's friends should rejoice and Israel's foes should beware.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we will move on to Mr. George Rishmawi.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm George. I'm from the town of Bethlehem. I lived all of my life under Israeli occupation. Yet I'm here to tell you this morning, if you are friends of Israel, I want you to be good friends of Israel. And to be a good friend of Israel is something that is really important. That if you are a good friend, that you need to know how to say what's right and what's wrong. Because if you are a good friend, you need to tell this is wrong and this is right. That's what I'm expecting from the United States of America. If it's a good friend of Israel, to say what's right and what's wrong. And in my opinion, I agree with Dr. Kaufman. Yes, people can continue being good friends of Israel, and that is very important. Secondly, talking about the green light to Israel, in my opinion, all administrations have been giving green light to Israel in order to build Israeli illegal settlements in the West Bank. Settlements has been really expanding in the West Bank, and Israel is now going silently with a unilateral disengagement plan within the West Bank by confiscating 61% of the West Bank. What does this mean? Confiscation of 61% of the West Bank has a very huge negative implications on the Palestinians living in the West Bank. Starting with my town, I am from the town of Bethlehem. This means my town is surrounded by 29 Israeli illegal settlements that confiscated most of the vacant, empty land around Bethlehem. So Bethlehem today is really very crowded. Land prices are very high. And when land prices are very high, that creates a lot of problems for young people. Ladies and gentlemen, this creates and causes immigration. Immigration that President Trump was fighting, or Europeans are fighting. Why do people immigrate? Because life becomes really miserable. And that's what caused immigration from our country. Because life becoming very miserable. What also that means that we are losing all of our freedom of movement. Maybe Americans, hard for them to understand what does the freedom of movement means, because you can literally drive your car from here all the way to New York or to Washington, D.C., but I simply cannot drive within my own country, within my own hometowns, driving anywhere because of the Israeli blockades and checkpoints and roadblocks and so on, which makes your life very miserable. Just imagine I spend precious time of my life and my other fellow Palestinians at checkpoints. And really a lot of time. It's a precious time of your life you're being spending at a checkpoint because of security reasons. Now, in my opinion, this has been a lot of green lights for violating Palestinian human rights that has been already provided by different American administrations. Now, in 1967, according to the Israeli narrative, Israel never wanted to go through this war, but Israel was forced to go to this war. Great. But why to impose between 1967 until today 600,000 illegal settlers within the West Bank and Jerusalem? Why to confiscate all these large amounts of land? This is becoming insane because life in Palestine is becoming much more difficult with the settlers and the attacks of the settlers on Palestinians constantly and every day. Now, we also need to talk about something really important. In the West Bank, which is summer is approaching right now, we have a big problem with water. When access to water and sanitation, ladies and gentlemen, become a political issue. Access to water and sanitation is an apolitical issue, is a basic fundamental human right. And that is when we really need to realize that human rights are being negotiated and human rights are being facing a lot of threat. Access to water and sanitation is my right. So I can talk about this later on, but it is very important for us to realize that in order to bring peace to everybody, justice has to occur for everybody else. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Now we'll move on to Neil.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming so early. I see a group of very young people right in front of me, like you guys. So particularly glad that you came. I hope you're not missing school. I hope you don't get in trouble. You're like 6th graders, 7th graders? 8th, okay, sorry about that. Great age, I know. But you're not going to get in trouble, right? We can write you notes. All right, excellent. Having been here for a couple of days, I do realize that a lot of the titles here are meant to be provocative, and I think this one is also provocative. And I actually don't disagree with its basic premise or analogy that Israel or any other state responds to signals. Signals coming from major powers, signals coming from regional powers, especially powers that you rely upon heavily, like Israel and the United States. But I would like to take issue with some of the other premises of the title that we have here. The first is, why are we only talking about green in terms of lights? And second, why don't we include the possibility that the traffic light is completely malfunctioning? Maybe it doesn't happen in Boulder, but it does happen in other places around the world where the signals that are supposed to be there, they're supposed to be coherent, actually aren't working very well at all, or sending out mixed signals. So as for the first, why only green? We know that many administrations rely heavily on other sorts of lights, particularly yellows, that is, warning signs. You shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. Please hit the brakes before you crash. And I think it is very likely that in Israel's relationship with the Trump administration, there will be many sorts of signals, yellow, red, and flashing yellows. So we shouldn't only think about red lights and green lights. I think it doesn't really work like that. Second of all, I think by now we should try to avoid thinking that we have a coherent administration that is capable of sending out monochrome signals that are easily decipherable to the rest of the world. We've seen very fast transitions about China, about NATO, pretty much everywhere around the world. We've seen flipping and flopping. So I think instead of traffic lights or that analogy, we should think about like a discotheque where you have reds and yellows and greens and flashing together and separately, and the rest of the world is sort of out there trying to make sense of what is going on. And I think that's going to be what we're going to see a great deal in the future. But these aren't actually my primary objections. One of the things you learn as a social scientist is to try to avoid two things. The first is to try to avoid making arguments that are monocausal, X causes Y. Because in reality, things are going to be much more complicated than that. And kind of the assumption behind the question is that, well, there's Israel in a car and it's waiting for some signal, and then it gets a signal and it's going to rush forward. But in Israel, there are many complicating factors. Just to give you a sense of some of them, Israel has a coalition government. The prime minister doesn't do whatever he wants. He is subject to multiple conflicting pressures from the center and from the right. So what seems to be, his policy is actually the product of multiple influences. We also need to consider that the Israeli right doesn't have serious opposition from the center or left. The left in Israel has been decimated over the years. So for thinking about car metaphors, there aren't too many breaks at the moment in terms of strong opposition parties. We also need to consider that Israel is engaged with the rest of the world, not only the United States. In response, partly to the Obama administration, partly in response to worsening relations with the European Union, Israel now has very cordial relations with India, very cordial relations with China as well. Both countries are sources of imports and exports, flourishing relationship between the two, and Israel is far less dependent on the United States than it used to be in the past. And I think we saw a lot of this during the Obama administration, where Netanyahu was quite willing to push aside various objections of the Obama administration. So I'll just leave you with that it's complicated in terms of causation, in terms of variables that are at play.
Thank you, and I apologize for the alarm because I didn't realize it was going to do that, so I'm sorry. Okay, now we'll move on to Micha.
Good morning, Boker Tov, Chag Sameach, for those of us who are celebrating Passover this week, our annual celebration of liberty and freedom. And I think there's a lot to discuss within there. There's a lot to pack in. And I wanna acknowledge for a second that I sit on a number of panels, and I'm very grateful that George is with us this morning, because for the most part here in the States, it's awkward that we have a discussion about what's going on in Israel-Palestine, and more often than not, there is not a Palestinian in the room to actually represent Palestinian voices, and I find myself somehow describing realities in Jerusalem that are not mine to describe. And George, thank you so much for coming. And I appreciate this conference this year that knew to make sure that wasn't the case. A good example was the Boulder Nablus Sister City project, which for the most part, from what I witnessed, was a debate among Jews, which I thought was very interesting. And that's kind of what happens here in the States as well. And I think for the question that we're asking here, what's the green light, is a very lofty question. Oftentimes when we have these discussions across the ocean about what's going on in Israel-Palestine, it's not as practical as I'd prefer them to be. Growing up in Jerusalem, there's some very practical issues that most Americans are just not aware of. I wasn't aware of as an Israeli living in Jerusalem. For example, that if you're not Jewish in Jerusalem today, you don't have the right to vote. And here we discuss Israel as, as the democracy in the Middle East, while there are practical issues in Jerusalem that are not discussed here. And I want to name a number of them for a second. When we talk about the security wall that's been around now for 11 years. And here in the States, it's known as the security barrier that stopped terrorism. Only in Israel, we know that the Ministry of Interior would report that at least 40,000 Palestinians will manage to find their way across the wall to find cheap-paying unregistered labor jobs. And if 40,000 Palestinians can find their way across the wall because they don't have a choice, they're desperate enough to risk time in prison for that, I can imagine that a suicidal terrorist will also figure their way out. I myself have walked through the gaps in the wall. Another is, to name some myths, is that the wall around Jerusalem doesn't necessarily separate Israeli and Palestinians. It's designed to surround Palestinian central business districts. In essence, separating business from workforce in the suburbs. So what that caused in Jerusalem, for example, is the separation of Azariah, Abu Dis, or Bethlehem, where George lives, from jobs, causing massive unemployment rates on the other side of the wall. And inside Jerusalem, over 5,000 Palestinian businesses to shut down over the last 10 years alone. In essence, what is happening in Israel today, it doesn't really matter, I feel, and from what we experience in Israel and the way our politicians are discussing it, it doesn't really matter who the president of the United States is, even though, for the record, Obama has been the strongest supporter of Israeli security to date, granting Israel the largest amount of money for security thus far. Still, the rhetoric is such that it looks like Trump is going to be a stronger supporter, but we steamroll ahead. 4 years at a time doesn't make that much of a difference. The momentum is very clear. We can't get away right now with putting Palestinians on trucks the way we did in 1948 to drive them out, which is a narrative that we don't learn in Israel. But we can make sure that there's massive unemployment. We can make sure that universities are not accessible. We can make sure that classrooms are overcrowded. We can make sure that there's very poor infrastructure and very poor waste management so that young couples my age in Palestine don't have a choice but to leave. And that's the momentum that's happening in Israel-Palestine today. And I think there's a lot more to discuss there. I don't think that Trump is going to make much of a difference in regards to that momentum. I think we're moving full speed ahead with that anyway. Thank you.
Thank you all, and I really appreciate your staying on track. This is wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so now I'll give you each 2 minutes to say whatever kind of came to your heart and your mind while listening to your fellow panelists, and we'll go down the line again, starting with Mr. Kaufman.
Most Israelis, if you take polls by Al-Haratz and others, consider Obama to be the weakest on Israel of any American president. So do I in my book, and take the book of Michael Oren, the great former Israeli ambassador, former classmate of mine at Columbia, Michael Bornstein. the view that Obama is a supporter of Israel is a distinctly minority view that I don't think corresponds to the evidence. Second, as for the plight of the Palestinians, which should evoke our sympathy and empathy, I don't believe that Israel is the primary author of it. To quote Abba, even the former UN ambassador, Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I would support peace, and I think Trump would, if I see three conditions. The end of the so-called right of return that is trying to eliminate Israel by an unprecedented definition of refugees, by a two-stage solution to eradication. Two, recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. And thirdly, if you're going to make peace, you have to humanize rather than demonize your adversary, the way the Israelis did in the 1980s with the revisionist movement under Benny Morris. I think it went too far. It was necessary. Until I see in Palestinian textbooks a change in its treatment of Israelis that could have been published by Goebbels in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, Israel has to keep its powder dry until the atmosphere for peace changes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Rishmawi.
Well, normally it's like I hear a lot that Israel is the weakest link and security is that what we really need to take care of. As Mika just said, that yes, it's a lot of military aid has been provided to Israel through the years, and Israel is a nuclear country also. Now, when we talk about the two-state solution, which is really interesting to me as a Palestinian living in the West Bank, the thing that occurs to my mind that Israel has killed the two-state solution and killed any other solution. And to be honest with you, I cannot find this solution happening because of all of the land confiscation and the settlements that's happening there. So if we want to talk about two-state solution, all the time, the question comes to my mind, where? How? With all of this policy of land confiscation and building the settlements, it's impossible. It is totally impossible, and that is one thing. The second thing, when we talk about the idea that Palestinians need to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, of course, Palestinians have accepted the two-state solution, yes, but in order to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, first of all, where is the Constitution of Israel that dictates that? And where are, according to this Constitution, or according to Israeli definition, where are the clear Israel of borders? Are they identified? There are no clear borders of Israel, and that is really becoming much more difficult thing to answer. Now, in my opinion, that is something that's really important. The second thing, when we talk about dehumanization, honestly, I want to tell you, you guys do not know what does it mean to be humiliated. You have no idea what I go through myself and my fellow Palestinians when we are humiliated constantly by Israeli soldiers. When you are not treated as a human being, you know, that is something that we can happy to elaborate afterwards. Thank you, Israel. I'll stop here.
Thank you. And thank you. And just a reminder, this card means you're allowed to finish your sentence. So sorry about that. Okay.
Well, I'm going to continue in my sort of college professorial role here and sort of not get so much in the weeds of the various internal problems, but rather focus on how we should think about politics, and particularly politics in the Middle East. I said in my earlier comments that one of the things that we're taught not to do as social scientists is to think that there's one cause for anything. And I think that's particularly true of very complicated historical problems. But I think the other thing that we're taught not to do is to make predictions. And I think if the Trump election taught us anything is to get out of the business of making predictions at all. We should all just stop doing it at all. Let's go bankrupt, do something else. But you know, when we look at the Middle East political ecosystem, I think there's even more reason to be skeptical of any sort of prediction we might dare to make here. There are just too many known unknowns. For example, Will the current Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, emerge unscathed from an ongoing corruption investigation? Okay, we don't know what's going to happen. Israel has a very strong security establishment, made mostly of former commandos, like the Prime Minister himself. They are a very strong security network. They're pretty conservative, and they are a restraining factor. So will they be important in the future or less so? Now, I didn't know there were going to be 8th graders here, so maybe you can close your ears while I say this. But will Ivanka Trump whisper in Jared's ear after they've had sex about the Palestinian-Israel issue? We don't know what goes on in the Trump White House in terms of who is affecting policy. I've heard just recently that Ivanka Trump was the most important influential advisor in the strike on Syria because she was upset at seeing the pictures of the children. Other variables. Will there be more compromise in the Palestinian community? Will they have unified government? We don't know this. Will the National Security Advisor outmaneuver Steve Bannon? We don't know this. So there are just too many things that we don't know to make any sort of predictions. And we just have to get used to a situation of learning day by day what's going to happen and sort of muddling through month by month, year by year.
Thank you. Mr. Kurtz.
Having had the pleasure of doing some advocacy around Jerusalem, working with consuls and ambassadors from all over the world, it became quite obvious that when it comes to the realities in Jerusalem, if you're living in Jerusalem, you're living in Israel, Palestine, you realize very quickly that for it's been 10 or 15 years since anybody had seriously discussed a two-state solution. When European consulates recognize this and understand that the reality has shifted, I think the last people in the room that are still holding on, the last bastion for a two-state solution, is the Americans who suggested it to begin with. And that's when it comes to our education or to having 2 feet on the ground, having a practical conversation on how to move forward, I think that's one of them. And another is when it comes to, Robert, you mentioned education in Palestinian schools. I've been welcomed in numerous Palestinian schools with open arms as a Jewish ally in many, many cities across the West Bank. And I want to note what's happening this week and my own upbringing, because I was raised very proudly. I spent about 14 or 15 years in uniform, having joining the Israeli Scouts in the 4th grade and graduating from there into a combat unit in the IDF, proudly wanting to serve my country. And I would have wanted to notice beforehand what happens around this time of year. Springtime in Israel is very specific, especially in Jerusalem. You all, for those of us who sat around a Passover table this week, we all globally, and especially in Jerusalem, repeat a mantra that specifically goes, B'chol dor v'dor ba'im alenu lechalotenu. Every generation, somebody is out there to annihilate us. That's a mantra that we repeat annually. And not just annually. In about 3 weeks, Israel is going to celebrate its, I'm going to have to wrap up in a sec, but Israel celebrates its Holocaust Memorial Day. And we connect the Holocaust with Passover in that way. We get our pharaohs and our Hitlers confused. And the week after that, we celebrate or we commemorate the Remembrance Day. And as a curriculum in schools, I don't know if you've ever been on Memorial Day to Israel, where there's a siren that goes off and life comes to a full stop. The banks close, public transportation, schools, drivers stop their cars and step outside for 2 days. We all stop our lives for a second. There's one other country in the world that does this. It's North Korea. The next week, the next day after that, we celebrate Independence Day. And we make the connection and we get our pharaohs and our Hitlers and our Ahmadinejads and our Yasser Arafats confused, knowing that everybody's out there to annihilate us. It doesn't really matter who. The Palestinians just happen to be there. And when it comes to our education, that's part of our Israeli education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mika. Okay, thanks everyone. And so now I'll open up the floor to questions. And just a reminder that I didn't mention at the beginning is that I will prioritize questions that come from students. So if you're a student and you submit a question on the app, just note in the question that this is a question coming from a student. And so with that said, and also if you would like to ask a question with a note card, just raise your hand and the gentleman will get you a card. Okay, so here's a student question. What should America do? What are we doing? And there's no in particular panelist, so feel free, whoever feels so inspired, to respond. What should America do?
What we are doing right now. First of all, I disagree with Neil. Although I believe there's a lot of initial strategic confusion in the Trump administration, that still persists most dangerously, in my view, in Asia, where Trump may underestimate the Chinese challenge. There is an emerging strategic view coming out of the Trump White House where Steve Bannon is out, Jim Mattis and National Security Advisor McMaster is in. It has three components. Make a clear distinction between a decent democratic Israel that, for all its flaws, is the only country that Freedom House, which is an independent rating service, consistently rates as free, not only for Israeli Jews, but for Israeli Arabs more than any other country in the region. Two, the primary threat in the region is hegemonic ambitions by a radical Islamic regime trying to cross the nuclear threshold. And three, the goal of the United States is to build a coalition, including Sisi's Egypt, Abdullah in Jordan, Trump just saw him, and the Saudi Arabians to deal with the greater Iranian danger. And these components should be and are the part of an American policy, in addition to which Nikki Haley has ended the UN's vendetta on stigmatizing Israel. Did you know that Israel, the freest country in the Middle East by any objective standard, receives 60% of all condemnatory resolutions from the UN Commission on Human Rights? Do you know that that commission is silent on Iran, North Korea, Putin, and increasingly authoritarian China? So I think that with Trump, we should continue the outlines of what we're doing now. It is a new day to the benefit of our interests and the interests in the region.
Thank you. George, can you respond to that? What should America do?
I think America can do everything, in my opinion. Such a great country. This great country can do great work if the leaders of this great country want to really achieve something. Now, America can be honest broker for peace. Honest broker for peace, that means we don't take sides. And we take the sides of everybody, not sides with anybody, but to take the sides of everybody. Now, this is where we fail. This is where, sorry, we're not American. This is where America fails to, by siding with Israel constantly and allowing Israel to do everything they want, this will never help to bringing peace in the Middle East. And this is the most fundamental issue for all the issues that Dr. Kaufman spoke about. This is the most fundamental issue that will help bringing peace to the Middle East and to bring a real good settlement for all the other conditions. Now, this is the most important thing, that America should not take sides. America should take sides of the human rights. My God, human rights are not for negotiations. Human rights are for implementation. That's the most important thing. I am surprised. I'm constantly surprised that America accepts and negotiates human rights. Why do we negotiate human rights? This is very fundamental, and this is where America can be, this great country, this great nation can do a lot in order to achieve peace in the Middle East. And I totally trust we can. I totally trust that we can bring peace. By the way, Dr. Kaufman and everybody else, I think there is no other solution. There is no other way. For me, living all of my life under occupation and my children living under occupation, I still believe might not happen through my lifetime, but I believe there is no other solution. We have to live together, but how will we live together if we don't live together as equal partners, where my human rights is completely respected? I don't see another way. That's the way to go. Respect my human rights, implement my human rights, and totally, let's work together to get to the end of this. And I think America, a great nation, can do a lot about this. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to pass on this one. I think clear answers require clear questions. And this question doesn't have an object. And if there was an object, I'd be able to answer something coherently, but there is none. So what should America do about what wasn't made clear. So I'm going to pass on this one.
I think there's some clear steps that can be taken. I think I agree with George when it comes to there are basic international agreements, international law, human rights. I think the US can take a far stronger stance on justice and human rights and equality in my city. I would like that if we're living by a Western standard of democracy, that everybody get a right to vote in my town, regardless of race or religion or gender, and we don't. And to that extent, if I were here in the States, if I were a citizen of the US, I would demand that my tax dollars not go in the billions and billions to somewhere that is that I would not consider democratic. Of all those UN resolutions, the US regularly vetoes at the Security Council and the UN resolutions that would limit Israel's violations of human rights. I think the US can take a much stronger stance for justice at the United Nations Security Council. Those are two very clear. When it comes to an unclear stance, Israel and the US are very strong financial partners. And this is since the mid-1980s. And when it comes to American ideals of capitalism and a free market, to watch as half of the population in my city deteriorates because there isn't an actual free market, because people can't make their way to work based on race, because shops are shutting down, schools are closing down, infrastructure is deteriorating. I think that's the opposite of what America actually believes. If there was even a checkpoint on Old Jericho Road, allowing people to come back to work and students back to schools and patients back to hospitals, that would allow East Jerusalem, the Palestinian capital, the major metropolitan area, to breathe again. But in fact, that's not the goal. And I think America knows that. And so I think America is complicit in this crime.
Thank you. So I've received a number of questions that are similar that I'll consolidate, and they're along the lines of, can a state be a democracy and a religious state at the same time?
Yes, a state can be a democracy and a religious state. And by the way, no one complains that most of the Islamic Middle Eastern states call themselves Islamic states. Why is Israel singled out? Now, when people say Israel is repressive, I paraphrase Winston Churchill, compared to what? Again, Freedom House is an objective rating agency, and Israel's the only state that rates on a scale of 1 to 7 as largely free. Look at how the Palestinians have governed themselves, tragically, sadly, when Israel did withdraw from Gaza. Gaza has become a Hobbesian hell where life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, or Dante's Ninth Chamber of Hell. Also, let's talk about realities. Israel has a strategic border in the north of a mere 8 miles. Any mistake that Israel makes is an existential mistake. We don't get that. And if the Golan Heights had been returned improvidently as peace advocates had advocated, Israel would now be in peril as a metastasizing Syrian civil war. It has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict, literally engulfs the region. So is Israel a perfect democracy? No, nor are we, but to quote the great philosopher Karl Popper, the search for the perfect is the enemy of the good, and we should not be an honest broker. Sadly, the Palestinians, in their collective political entity, supported Hitler during World War II. The Jews did not. The Soviet Union during the Cold War, Israel was a staunch ally, cheered Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Israel was a stalwart ally. And any sound moral and practical foreign policy distinguishes favorably your decent democratic friends from your illiberal foes trying to extinguish the freedom we both share. So the answer is Israel is a religious state and a democracy, and is a state we should admire rather than demonize.
It's very interesting. Actually, during my visit to Boulder, I had the chance to celebrate the Seder dinner of Passover for the first time. It was joy for me to hear about all of this spirituality that comes with Passover. Indeed, it is very liberating, and then I was so happy. I said, this is the type of theology that we need to tell the world about the Jewish people. This should be the image of the Jewish people. And I was so happy to hear that. Now, having said that, let us think about what does it mean to have a Jewish democratic state. A Jewish democratic state, that means that this state has to have Jewish majority, right? In order to continue being Jewish. This means that this state will be racist against anybody that's not Jewish. That's what's happening to 1.7 million Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, facing all kinds of difficulties. Yes, of course, they have better rights than I have. They are part of the Israeli Knesset, but still facing a lot of discrimination, and they are still Israeli citizens. And that's why, because they are looked at as a demographic threat. Forget about the Palestinians living in the West Bank, but this is looked at as a demographic threat. For me personally, I don't believe in any kind of religious state, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever. I totally don't care. What I care for is a state that's for everybody, for all citizens. It doesn't matter. What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong, Dr. Kaufman. I for sure think that also United States is an ally with other states that call themselves Muslims and Muslim state, and for me, I see a lot of dictatorships in these states, and still allies of the United States. I don't understand why. For example, liberating Kuwait was about to bring monarchy back, for example, not bring a republic or bring in democracy. Now, and I think it's very important that a religious state will always create threats for anybody that does not belong to that religion. It doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter how. So what is the danger here? The danger is fundamentalism is a danger, is a threat, constantly. If it's Islamic, or if it's Christian, or it's Jewish, we have to acknowledge that fundamentalism will always be a threat for all humanity. And that is really very important. How can we eradicate fundamentalism? Eradication of fundamentalism by creating job opportunities for people, stop humiliation, allow people to travel, allow people to move, allow people time to breathe, allow people time to dream. And this is what's really not happening in the Middle East now, because we have no chance to breathe or to dream or to think of somebody else or to think of a better future, because we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that is very important. That makes fundamentalism stronger. I'm sorry to say that. Yet also what we see on the other side, that Israel is funding religious schools at the Israeli settlements that are producing a lot of fundamentalism that's coming out of these settlements. My God, all of this money is coming to create and to push and create fundamentalism. And that's dangerous. Any kind of fundamentalism is dangerous, and we need to make sure that we stop that. We need to make sure that humanity is respected everywhere. When humanity is not respected anywhere, this means it's not respected everywhere. It doesn't mean that you sit here in America and you don't face any humiliation, that other humans are being humiliated every day. And this is where we need to stop and say, stop all of this kind of humiliation that's taking place in the Middle East. Thank you.
I'm going to continue wearing my hat here as political science professor. One of the things you learn in graduate school in political science is the importance of defining terms and defining concepts. And I think democracy is one of those essentially contested concepts. Because when you look at democracy around the world, it's a very large family. Many countries call themselves democratic, which have free and fair and frequent elections. Others have other institutions which might be less democratic, but still can count as democracies. And one of the things that we do to make our definition of democracy clear is simply to add adjectives before democracy. So that you have liberal democracies, and you have consociational democracies, and illiberal democracies. And when you do it that way, it's easier to differentiate between different regime types. Israel is a Jewish state. It's by definition a Jewish state. And it's a Jewish state because Jews won the war in 1948. And as a result of that, Jews have a state and the Palestinians don't have a state. And that's, I think, pretty straightforward in history. You win a war and you can get a state. That's how it's always worked. It's certainly worked in American history. There's a political scientist named Sami Samoucha who has coined the term ethnic democracy. Israel is an ethnic democracy. The United States is a liberal democracy. In a liberal democracy, the state does not take any position on questions of religion. It is neutral vis-a-vis religion. In ethnic democracy, it is recognized in the definition that the majority ethnic group will have most of the power. And this is certainly the case in Israel. The state is defined in terms of its dominant ethnic group. Israel is certainly not the only state that is an ethnic democracy. But the difference between an ethnic democracy and a state like South Africa, where there was apartheid, is that in Israel, at least within the Green Line, Palestinians do have rights. They can vote, they can participate in political affairs, they can sue in the Supreme Court, they are allowed to write articles, they have representation in the Knesset. They are a minority group and will forever remain a minority group. And this is true by definition of an ethnic democracy. And in some ways, it's just comparing a liberal democracy to an ethnic democracy is comparing apples and oranges. There are different types and they have different internal dynamics. And so the appropriate comparison to Israel would be to another country which has a dominant ethnic group, which the minority does have right to fight for more power, but is still outside of the main power arrangements. So the answer to this question is yes, so long as we understand that there are democracies of different types. And we should be careful not to judge one on the basis of standards that we've established for others with completely different history. Right? The United States history is very different with regard to religion than France and certainly most all countries in the Middle East for sure.
Thank you. I really appreciated that. and to be able to tell the difference. I have to say, to be living in a liberal democracy right now, I am offended this week that people don't have a week off for Passover. And I appreciate that we do in Jerusalem. However, when it comes to a Jewish state, it's funny that the statistics about Israel conveniently don't include the massive unemployment rates or realities in the occupied territories, as if Israel does not fully control what happens in the occupied territories. Even with a quasi-government of the Palestinian Authority or UN agencies that are running the bureaucracies inside, barely, Israel still determines what happens there. And so I think if we were honest about Israel, we wouldn't only be judging it by within the green line. But even then, within the green line, when we you're right, on paper it looks great. I'm offended often that we will need to constantly say Israel is doing great within its neighborhood. I don't want us to be, I don't want to equate Israel within that neighborhood. I want to level a standard of democracy that's higher than Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and I think you do too. And I think we're entitled to actually, when it comes to the comparison, to take it to Europe, to take it to a higher standard. Within that, knowing that Israel, with its Jewish majority, will also prioritize infrastructure for a Jewish majority. It's not a coincidence that 30,000 Bedouins in the south have displacement orders on their homes, even though they're citizens. It's not a coincidence that if you're living in a Palestinian city in Israel, not one hospital has been built since 1948, that schools are deteriorating, that national pipelines and highways and railways are built through Palestinian farmlands, creating more unemployment, and not through Israeli lands. This is how we prioritize one race, one ethnicity over the next. And while we can call it a Jewish democracy and say, sure, we enjoy freedoms more than others in the Middle East, I would call it a democracy for Jews. And the Palestinians just have to learn to deal with it.
Sort of a follow-on to that last question is, so assuming that Israel is, and this is also from a student, assuming that Israel is a democratic state, how do they justify the illegal settlements that are being built within the West Bank? And the student referred to a document that the UN published in December 23rd, 2016. Or maybe they stated, maybe it wasn't a document, but anyway, how does democratic state defend or justify illegal settlements and violation of international human rights?
One, I don't accept the premise of the question, but two, before I explain why, Neil, I agree and disagree with you that there's a difference between an ethnic and a liberal democracy, but Israel is an ethnic democracy which is largely liberal by the category of political science. Government is limited on what it can do to any citizen. There is the rule of law, and there are rights beyond which no government can go, and that's universal in Israel, including Palestinians' right to worship, free speech, own property, and have access to the courts. So Israel is an ethnic democracy that by the standards of the world and the region is liberal. This idea of Israel being illegally occupying the territories, I have two law degrees. But on this issue, I've heard it from the horse's mouth. The person who drafted UN Resolution 242 is the former professor of law at Yale, Eugene V. Rostow, whom I know and worked with on my second book. Eugene Rostow deliberately drafted UN Resolution 242 to say territories, not the territories. And by removing the article the, if you're a lawyer, that from the beginning signified the Johnson administration's recognition that you could not go back to the borders of 1967, which Abba Eban rightly called Auschwitz or suicide borders, where Israel had a strategic depth of 8 miles in its northern corridor and a maximum of 60 miles. So I reject, and so would the author of UN Resolution 242, the idea that Israel is occupying territories any more than in my native city of Boston, I have to return Fenway Park to the loyalists who fled the American Revolution, a third of the country, or the Massachusetts Indians. We are applying on Israel a double standard that literally no nation in history, including ours, has ever met. And when all of you folks go home and return your homes to Native Americans when their forebears say, this was mine, then you can ask the Israelis to do the same thing. But unless you're going to do this as a categorical imperative, this is an invidious double standard that demonizes a state by asking them to do in a dangerous neighborhood what we're asking nobody else to do. There's a name for that, and I don't like it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kaufman. I think it's very interesting that we talk about law and order. Now, if you are a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you need to know what type of law that is being implemented on you. The most important thing is called Israeli military orders. This means the Israeli commander can issue an order that will become part of the law immediately. And this is basically the basic thing. By living under Israeli military control, is the Israeli military orders that can be these orders put together to benefit Israel for everything, including land confiscation. Land confiscation that happens in the West Bank can be justified under different things. The basic idea is security, public use as well. These land confiscation that happens under public use in the area of the land that has been classified during Ottoman times as public state land. Now, these public state land that Palestinians during Ottoman rule, 400 dark years, that couldn't register all of their land because of the Ottoman taxes that was very much imposed on them. In 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, Israel said that this is a state land, so it's nobody's land, so this will be the state land where we are going to build the settlements. Yet, according to the peace now, a lot of the settlements are built on Palestinian private land. Now, but let us take the core of the problem. The core of the problem of the settlements that Jews want to live in the entire areas of Israel, right? In the entire Israel, including the West Bank. This is where they are making a mistake. The mistake is, if I am, for example, moving to Boulder, I need to move to Boulder as a friend and neighbor, not as an occupier. And that is where the biggest problem is happening, that settlers are moving to the West Bank as occupiers of the land, and taking private land and confiscating Palestinian freedom and confiscating all Palestinian life and confiscating all the Palestinian property where we can expand and build our towns and build our future. Now, rather than people moving as friends and neighbors, people were moving as occupiers. And that's why this is the core of the problem. This is the core of the issue. This is where people have failed to deal with the Palestinians, and rather than a friends of neighbors, but rather I prefer to deal with you as an occupier. This is where people have been resisting it. Now, if I come back to the issue that Dr. Kaufman just spoke about, that the territories or territories. Okay, what do you want? What do you want me to do? This will take us to nowhere. This will take us to nowhere. This is indeed right now taking us nowhere. We are living in the limbo. We are living no two-state solution, no one-state solution. It's not clear to me where we are going. It's not clear to me what is really happening. It's not clear to me. Are we going to two-state solution? Are we going to one-state solution? Or what type of solution we need to have? If we want to continue having the Israeli settlements controlling because of the three letters V, controlling all the lives, this means we are going to put the Palestinians in Bantustans in completely closed areas. Density of population is very high, crime rate is going to become very high, and drug issues and alcohol is going to become a huge issue, where we are living in crowded areas that have no future, and we will look forward to immigrate to your country. This is exactly what's happening now. This is the situation as it stands. So what do you want me to do? Tell me what you want. How to exit out of this? I don't have an answer. My answer to exit out of this, either we go for one of the solutions, or we implement human rights, or we stop the settlements, and we find a solution how to live together. I don't know. I am completely stuck. I don't see any future out of this. By continuing building the settlements, continuing putting us in Bantustans, no access to water, no freedom of movement, including to the holy sites, I don't know what is the exit strategy for Israel out of this. I don't know the exit strategy for America who's supporting this. It's not clear to me at all. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to parse out the question in two ways. The first way is to say, how does Israel justify illegal settlements? This is an historical question. The second way is to say, how does Israel justify these settlements? And I think that's the way you respond to it. I'm going to answer in the historical way because there are facts. How does Israel justify these settlements? Well, basically several ways. First, on defense grounds. Both the left and the right have made the argument that Israel does not have enough strategic depth. It needs to hold on territory to prevent future attacks. So I'm not saying if this is legitimate or not. This is an historical question of how we assess various justifications that have been given by Israeli governments over the years. So the first line has been defense. The second line has been religion. And if you want to understand the Middle East, you have to take religion seriously. And the people who live on the West Bank, a significant majority of them, think that these settlements are not illegal, that this land belongs to the Jews because it says so in the Bible. You can agree with this or not, but that is their perspective. So defense, the second is religion. The third has often been retaliation. It's sort of a way, building settlements is a way to stick it to the Palestinians when they do something the Israeli government does not like. So it's a sort of a tit-for-tat game, a tactical maneuver of sorts. But I think those three categories covers a lot of the justifications that have been offered over the years.
I think it's strange that we would define something as a defensive tactic by moving a civilian population into an area we are saying is a dangerous area. I think to begin with, that's a flawed argument. I think when it comes to the settlements around Jerusalem, we know them mostly by now. Israel knows Gilo, Givat Ze'ev, Ramot as not as settlements, but as suburbs. What we don't remember, though, is in the 1970s, every single one of these large suburbs today was planted there, first and foremost, by a group of Jewish supremacists who took up a hill saying, this is our God-given land, with guns saying, this is mine. And even though, according to Israeli law, whether it's a left-wing or a right-wing government, they know that that is land theft, because they're Jews, and because it was controversial and not knowing quite what to do with it, the army said, they're saying, we're not supporting that, we're not building that. And the Israeli government said, at least since they're Jews, we have to go protect them. So what that looks like is a military unit that goes out and sets up camp outside of these 2 or 3 caravans, And in order for that unit to do its job properly, they're probably going to have to pave a road up to that area. They're probably going to have to set up some minimal infrastructure like electricity and a latrine or two. And once that minimal infrastructure is there, it's simple to bring another 2 or 3 caravans to the area and for somebody to open a nursery school. And once there's a nursery school and it's growing a little bit, we can open another 4 or 5, we bring over another 4 or 5 caravans and it grows, and we need to open a first grade and probably a corner store. And once there's a first grade and a corner store and it starts growing from then on, at some point it really does become what we can call a settlement or a community. And at some point, one of the Israeli governments are going to give it a kosher stamp of approval and say, all right, we can't, it's practically anti-Semitic in Israel to displace Jewish families. At some point, it receives an okay from the government, and then it gets government funding. And it gets government funding and subsidized funding at that point because consistently Israeli governments have subsidized life beyond the 1967 borders, beyond the Green Line. More so than in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, where families are dealing with poverty and welfare. The settlements have received more funding from Israeli governments consistently as time goes on than any other government project. At this point in time, what we often quote is the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution, saying, we can have a two-state solution. At the Oslo Accords, Ehud Barak famously stepped up to the podium, the Prime Minister of Israel famously stepped up to the podium addressing the Israeli nation, saying, we're not going to negotiate this time. We're going to give them the most generous offer. And if they don't take it, they're either terrorists or they're clowns, and they don't really want peace. And this was repeated time and again in Israeli media, and it's what most of us know to say here in the States as well. And he goes into Camp David, and I remember, because this was the end of the 90s, and we were very excited for peace to finally come around, and we were all holding our breath, and lo and behold, Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, had said no. He turned us down, flat out. And Ehud Barak stepped back up to the podium, and he gave Israelis the clearest message we've ever received since, and we repeat this mantra time and again since. There's no partner for peace, there's no partner for peace, there's no partner for peace. And shortly after that, the second Intifada broke out and all hell broke loose. And we never took a moment, at least for Israelis, to understand, wait a minute, why did Chairman Arafat say no? We're giving them 90 or 95% of the occupied territories. And the last 5 or 10%, we're going to swap in land swaps. What can possibly go wrong? And what we know, and because we were told those 5 or 10%, those are the settlements that Israel does not want to give up. Because we don't want to displace what are today hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens that are living within what would be a Palestinian state. And what was not shown to the Israeli public, or the American public for that matter, is a map understanding where those settlements are. So let's just name those 3 chunks of settlements. Settlement number 1 around Ariel happens to sit on one of the largest water aquifers in the West Bank, leaving Israel in control of the Palestinian water resources. Number 2 is the Jordan Valley, the border between Palestine and Jordan, which would leave Israel in control of all Palestinian states' international borders.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Micha, but the time is up, believe it or not. And
I'm just going to finish my point.
Okay, finish your point, and then we'll wrap up. I apologize.
Last settlement, maybe most important, Ma'ale Adumim, just outside of Jerusalem, leaves Israel in control of the largest Palestinian metropolitan city, the capital and the economic capital, also dividing the Palestinian territories into cantons. What Chairman Arafat understood at the time that Israelis were not aware of was that the Palestinian state, what he was asked to say yes to, was a Palestinian state without international borders, without water, and without territorial continuity. Essentially, Bantustan similar to South African apartheid. And he said no. But what we've heard since then was there's no partner for peace, there's no partner for peace, there's no partner for peace. On this level, Israel knows exactly what it's doing. The settlements are there to make sure it doesn't happen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to the wonderful questions. If you still have more questions you'd like to direct to any of the panelists, please see them out in the lobby where you can continue the conversation. Thanks so much, everyone.